After a short hiatus, Culture of Coal is back with a new aim. Following on from covering the anniversary of the 1984-85 miners' strike, Podcastle will now be exploring how mining heritage and stories resonate with coalfield communities across the length of Britain. To begin, I sat down with Dr. Narbi Price, an artist who has worked across the former Northumberland and Durham coalfields. Over the past year, Narbi has worked with journalist Mark Hudson, who lived in Horden, County Durham following the end of the strike, writing a book called Coming Back Brockens. Based off Mark's book, Narbi has produced 40 paintings of the town and landscape around Horden, reflecting on the memory and future of the community. The exhibition, titled Going Back Brockens, has been touring across County Durham, and I sat down with Narbi to hear more about his work and the inspiration behind the project. So, Narbi, what's your background and how did you become interested in the subject of the miners' strike and in post-industrial landscapes?
I suppose I've always been interested as an artist in the everyday, I guess, overlooked things. If you see my work, it's not typically sort of aesthetic, pretty landscapes or anything, but I would call myself a landscape painter. In terms of my background, it's pretty standard university, school, college, foundation course, university. Had a bit of time off after my degree. Was in bands and doing gigs and running record labels and things like that for a few years, and then I went back to do my masters, and sort of just started being an artist for a bit. And then in 2014, 2015, I became aware of a opportunity for a PhD that was going to be run by Newcastle University that was ostensibly about art education. There was a piece of research that was done by Tate called Art School Educated, and it looked at fine art, the teaching of fine art between the 30s and 70s. And Newcastle University wanted a project specifically about their contribution to fine art pedagogy. And it was an open brief. All they said is they wanted it to be looking at the Ashington group, the Pitman painters. And my approach to it was to look at how the Ashington group had made paintings. So I'm a paint nerd, and there's been at that point had been no consideration about how they actually made the paintings, the techniques of them. There's one book by William Fever, Pitman Painters, the Ashington Group, 1934 to 1984. That's pretty much a blow-by-blow account of this happened, this happened, this happened, and there was this gap for this extra research. They were a super interesting group of artists, mine workers and people who were employed by the mine in Ashington and the surrounding 5 pits, coming together in 1934, as an offshoot of the Workers' Educational Association. So most of them had left school at the age of sort of 12 to 14, went straight down the pit. So there was this hunger, this appetite for extra education and self-betterment. They decided to learn about art appreciation, which wasn't part of the syllabus, so they asked the WA to put on this class. And a chap called Robert Lyon came from King's College, as it was, now Newcastle University, to teach them about art. He initially tried this slideshow sort of format that was congruent with teaching of fine art at that point. And he didn't get anywhere because the guys had basically never seen paintings, most of them. So to have them learn about the challenges of the artist, he had them make work. It quickly became evident that they were onto something. They were making work that was about their own lives. And this kind of led to this 50-year career. They came together in 1934 in the Depression of the 30s and disbanded in 1983, just before the miners' strike and in the recession of the 80s. So there's an interest in socio-political bracketing with them. And when I was making work about them, I found myself in Ashington quite a lot, deindustrialised landscape and walking. Decided to make paintings. It was a PhD by practice. So I decided to make paintings of their walks to work. So a lot of the guys' addresses were recorded in correspondence on the backs of paintings. So I would start at their house and walk to where they went to work, which was typically either not there. There's in that area, there's only Woodhorn Museum, where you've got the clue of a hint of what the size of the landscape was. One of them is now a business park, Ashington Colliery. Linton is a scrapyard. Lynmouth just isn't there anymore. So you have all of these sort of landscapes that are functioning differently than towns are built up to function, things that aren't there anymore. So the rhythms of towns change, and I found that very, very interesting. So I made these 30 paintings in 2018, which were shown at Woodhall Colliery, and it was things that caught my eye on the way. So, like I mentioned, I'm very much interested in the everyday, and painting is a way to process that, I guess, and it does it in a different way than photography does. It's a sort of slower way of looking, and I think because documentary photography, particularly around deindustrialized landscapes, is sort of the ubiquitous way that a lot of the visual work is made about it. It's a very clear and a very succinct and a very evocative way to do it, but I wanted to do something slightly different. So the paintings have a lot of quite gestural things happening in them. There's got quite a lot of hypersaturated color, quite a lot of thick paint, thin paint, drippy paint, and it just sort of changes the speed of looking, I think, and is something more analogous to the speed of consumption of a landscape when you walk through it, rather than maybe when you would drive through it or get the bus through it or get the train through it or whatever. And it was a way to kind of painting makes you think about time. I think it makes you think about the time that it took to make the painting, the time that might have passed since the painting, in particularly my kind of painting, between the time when I made the painting, yours when you're viewing the painting, and the deeper time that landscape always suggests. There's something quite almost encoded in a painting, is this layering of time, which you could see as analogous to the passing of time through landscape, through building, through geology, and so on.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting, it fascinates me really that the way these landscapes are sort of surround us, but people don't realise what they were for. You pass a former slag heap, and today a lot of people wouldn't know unless you have a sort of a deep knowledge of the area that was ever related to the coal industry. I can think about it locally to myself, the same sort of thing. But I know you've made the point that people live now in former mining communities in the northeast and Scotland, Wales, Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, and they're living in these places and they don't actually realise the places were built off the back of coal, off the back of the mine industry. But today people don't even know that existed or was there. And it's I suppose through your work you're engaging people in that, aren't you, and bringing that to their attention.
Yeah, hopefully. And it went on from making this work about Ashington to a few years down the line getting asked by No More Now to an Arts Council Creative People and Places project in County Durham. Again, with an open brief, a painter who works for them, called Ellen Ranson, had seen my PhD show, and she said, come and do some work about County Durham. And it was as open as that. And that's quite a big ask, quite an intimidating ask. County Durham is a big county, nothing compared to as big as Yorkshire, obviously, as a proud Yorkshireman I'm speaking to here. But there's a lot of quite diverse landscapes in there. There's a dramatic coastline, there's hills, there's forests, there's towns. And yeah, so the first thing that occurred to me when being asked to make work about County Durham was, well, yeah, mining is, this kind of overarching big presence when you think about County Durham. And then it was coming up to the anniversary of the miners' strike, so it felt logical to hang something off that, 40 years. And the simple thing to do, which I slightly came to regret later, was to do 40 paintings. It's interesting what you said about sort of slag heaps there and people not having an idea of what used to be there. Slag heaps are quite interesting because they typically are either eradicated, they get raked back down the shafts, or taken away, or they're landscaped into something. You've got in Northumberland, you've got the earthwork Northumberlandia, the Charles Jenks sort of earthwork sculpture thing, Our Lady of the North, which is slag heaps. They call her Slag Alice near Cramlington where she is. But they very often get reforested. And that is an interesting thing in itself, because as soon as you tune into it, you can read a landscape through that reforesting. These quick growing forests that are planted very close together, they grow stick straight, and they've got very shallow root structures. So in gales, they very frequently fall over. And in the exhibition that I'm sort of touring around at the moment, there's several paintings of those shallow, quite quite ugly sort of forests. But I think when you sort of tune into sort of decoding a landscape, um, you find yourself kind of being able to read things in towns, in countrysides, and you kind of tune in to the rhythms that things might have once functioned. You might look up and notice that you're going past the welfare hall or whatever. It might be a Greg's on the ground floor, but it's probably got some sort of slightly grander stuff going up. That kind of ornament that was very frequently put on these municipal buildings or these mine buildings. The stuff that hints at the wealth and the prosperity. Like kind of if you go to the Northwest is a really good example of when people who were in industry were philanthropists and built these municipal sort of things in mining towns. You typically have infrastructure. You've got the welfare hall. Sometimes you've got libraries. You've got music halls. You've got all of these kind of things that were there to entertain the populations, which were only there because of the pits. And now, as you sort of astutely say, when that infrastructure goes away, when the purpose goes away, then we're left in this sort of no man's land of, I'm not sure what it's of, but you're in this no man's land that no longer has that infrastructure and that reason, that purpose, that singular purpose that everyone shared. And I think that's the thing that is sort of the saddest things about the dissolving of the communities. That singular sense of purpose has gone away.
Yeah, it's a tragedy really that I think everybody knows and everybody's felt in a former mining community or former industrial community across the UK. The finest example of a miner's welfare that I've seen is in South Kirby in Wakefield, at the bottom end of Wakefield near Doncaster. The former miner's welfare was saved when the pit shut in the late 80s, and now it's like a kung fu and karate centre. So you've got the miners, etched at the top of the building is a miner digging at coal, and then you've got like a giant kung fu panda sticking out the top of it. Like the other day, and it's absolutely fantastic. But at least it's been used for the community, and it's still like in use, and it's getting a new lease of life. So it's hilarious. But yeah, at least it's in use.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a bit about the exhibition that you're doing at the minute, and I'm going to actually butcher this because I'm not from County Durham. Going Back Brockens is the name, but I know it's Going Back Brockens. It's monuments and rhetoric after the miners' strike. I want to ask you, why did you choose monuments and rhetoric? Because I think they're two really interesting ways of like framing it, and I wanted to sort of know what got you to pick that.
Yeah. So the title of the show, Going Back Brockens, is a reference to the book that was written by Mark Hudson in 1990, I think it came out, which was called Coming Back Brockens. And that in itself is a sort of esoteric phrase. So Coming Back Brockens refers to a technique to close a seam, a coal seam. So you would pull the struts out the props out as you went back, and the shaft would collapse behind you. So coming back broken. So it's that kind of pitmatic, County Durham pitmatic phraseology. Going Back Brockens, we were really struggling for a title, so the show is these paintings, but with sound clips from Mark's book that were recorded in 91 to 92, I think, and have never been heard. They've just been used for Mark to take his quotes for the book from. So it's an incredible sort of untapped archive of stuff, and largely from people who are no longer with us. And Going Back Brockens was a sort of back reference, just as a sort of subtle indication that there's this extra context, there's this extra, we're looking back specifically at that book, and it's about the evolution and the time that's passed since that, the 30 years since that book came out. Monuments and Rhetoric after the miners' strike. So we were talking about, Mark and I, about the two elements, the paintings and the sound. And the artists, Jane and Louise Wilson from Newcastle, did a piece that opened a Baltic in Gateshead, I think in the early 2000s. That was it was basically a film that was made around the Apollo Pavilion in Peterlee by Victor Passmore. at that point, it's always been a controversial thing, kind of at some points absolutely sort of vilified and bricked up and, kind of used by smackheads to shoot up in all kinds of stuff. Now it's got a bit of a renaissance and people are appreciating the uniqueness of it and the quality of it as a piece of modernism. Anyway, they made this video piece, Jen and Louise, like I say, in the early 2000s, and it was called A Free and Anonymous Monument. And that was a reference to a snippet of an interview that Victor Passmore had given in the late 70s. And that the idea that the paintings that I've made are these, they're chosen for particular reasons. So they take the 13 pits that were still open in 1984 in County Durham, and those are the starting points for the sites and all the paintings, and their walk sort of around maybe a couple of miles radius of those sites where the collieries were. And the things I've chosen, we talked about them becoming sort of monuments, but anonymous monuments, kind of monuments that you would walk past and not necessarily notice. So that was the monuments part of it. And the rhetoric, I'm not too keen on that word rhetoric, to be quite honest, but Mark was. It comes from the speech, the way the people spoke in those interviews that we're showing, were the soundscape. People spoke incredibly passionately and eloquently and poetically, so poetically that I've taken the titles of the 40 paintings from those sound clips, taking the word rhetoric in that context to mean something akin to that monumental thing. So it's, monuments and rhetoric after the miners' strike, these two things that have become quite totemic, I guess, two little totemic things that have come from, again, I think the thing that ties these things together is the everydayness of them. The fact that I've taken these things that are easily ignorable and chosen to focus time, attention of my own, and then time and attention of the viewer on them, changes them, and it switches your experience as a viewer to question about what might have been there. And in a similar way, the sound clips have this completely throwaway thing, but when you actually take them out of their context, there's this like incredibly rich, I'm going to say it, rich poetry in the everydayness of how people have spoken. So they're very sort of two mirrored sort of elements, I guess, the monuments and the rhetoric.
And why, sort of what interested you in highlighting this legacy 40 years on? What do you think this past sort of means for communities in Durham and Northumberland today?
I think the interest in it is in that time that's gone past and the changes. So, I was too young to have first-hand experience of it. I was 5 or something when 4 or 5 when the strikes were happening. But a lot of my earliest memories are televisual. So there are 3 very formative things that I remember distinctly from that time. One of them was the IRA bombings. One of them was Tommy Cooper dying on stage, and the other one was the miners' strike and the battling, the battles and Orgreave and all of the stuff that was being reported in the news. And I'm not from a mining background, but my granddad was a crane driver in Hartlepool, and a lot of the coal from County Durham would go down to Hartlepool. So there was this sort of symbiotic relationship. And it was just the sort of, even then at that young age, I could recognise that there was a disconnect in between what I was seeing on TV and the faces that I recognised as like my granddad's mates, and the vilification that was going on. So I think that time having passed, and the people largely, their work went away, their industry went away, the community went away, and now 40 years later, a lot of the people have gone away. But of course, other people have come to replace them, and that idea that people are living in places that no longer have the same purpose, I find endlessly fascinating. And I suppose it's a lot of the artwork in particular that you see about mining and mining communities is a very particular type. You've got your people like the Ashton Group, like Norman Cornish, Bob Otley. Is that what it's called? No, Bob Ollie. Edit that. and then you've got the which are quite sort of sentimental, nostalgic, and then you've got documentary photography from the strike, which is usually very evocative and quite visceral stuff. Yeah, so you have these sort of two camps. You've got the nostalgia and the sentimentality, heroic, working class, shirts off, pickaxes, that kind of painting, and then you've got the the overcoats and trudging up the path to the pit head and all of that kind of work, and then you've got the grainy black and white documentary stuff, and I think that's what I wanted to think about the gap that's been left by that time that's gone past, how painting can do it in a different way than photography can, and how a particular type of painting can really kind of change how we might think about that legacy, that time, that history, that void that's been left, but in a very matter-of-fact way. It's as political a body of work as the viewer is. In terms of it being small p political, there's always going to be a slight politic because I've chosen a particular thing to make paintings of. I hope that it's not preachy. It allows a lot of quite honest, matter-of-fact reflection to be possible, I hope.
Where can people see the exhibition now? Because I know you've toured in different places, haven't you, in Durham, but you've got a few things coming up, I believe.
Yeah. So it opened in Bishop Auckland in July in this old Wilco's warehouse with this incredible sort of concrete honeycomb roof, and we sort of built a gallery in that space, but in a way that didn't fight with the architecture. So there were these gaps that you could see through, and it was quite a cool thing. Then we also built a gallery at the 139th Miners Gala, the big meet again. That was a long day. At the moment, it's at Horden, St Mary's Church, the Miners Cathedral. It's there, probably be gone by the time this comes out. It's there until the end of August 31st. But then we're finishing the year in the only sort of traditional gallery setting so far at Sunderland Museum and Winter Gardens. That opens on September the 12th and runs through to January the 3rd. We've got a few irons in the fire for 2026, but nothing's set in stone yet.
And it is I mean, I've seen the exhibition at Durham, and it is a fantastic. I think the thing that I liked about it personally, and that spoke to me, is that although it was specific places and specific landscapes in Durham, it spoke to the places that I've seen myself in Yorkshire and in different parts of the UK. You look at it and it could be somewhere that down the street from me. I really like that. It's specific, but it also has that bigger reach. And
yeah, I mean, a lot of the interest in taking it outside of County Durham is exactly that. There's a paradox at these specific places, but they're also quite generic in terms of those common problems. So I am really interested to see how it would go down in Yorkshire, in Derbyshire, in Nottinghamshire, in Wales, and even further, abroad in France, in Poland. I think there's a universal thing that happened globally, certainly within Northern Europe anyway, at around the same time. So I think there will be incredible commonalities. It'll be really interesting to see how it goes down in different parts of the country if we can get that to happen.
Yeah, and before I close up, the question I want to ask you is, I know you've done a PhD on the Ashington Group and on pitman painters. Obviously, something there can be no more pitman painters because there is no more pits. But something I thought was interesting to ask you was how do you think culture now will sort of evolve in communities in places like County Durham? And do you think that people with that lack of industry and that sort of struggle for identity, do you think young artists, new artists can emerge, or do you think it's going to be a really difficult sort of thing? I know you're doing some really interesting work with No More Now and to try and encourage culture, but I just thought I'd ask your reflections on it.
I think it's a really interesting period, and in some ways the thing that's changed everything so much is technology and the speed and the dissemination of information and misinformation. But I think the real thing that things like No More Now, projects like No More Now can do is get that conversation going quicker and show people that things are possible and things aren't I think, kind of challenging the maybe quite staid notions of what art or creativity can be. Speaking very kind of linked to this, there's a group of films that were made by Carl Joyce, who's from Horden, and he's a filmmaker from Horden. And other things going on in Horden. Ensemble 84, this fantastic theatre group in the old Methodist Church, bringing absolutely incredible theatre to Horden. I mean, it's still a little bit like bringing someone coming in and bringing something to the place rather than the co-creation. But the things that Carl Joyce has done are very much, from the in going out. And the films he's made 6 films that are called Where We Belong, Where We Live, Where We Belong. Where We Belong, that's right, yeah. Are a range of different sort of opinions, and there's hope in them, And I think the fact that, doing things like the Going Back Brockens exhibition and speaking to people, there's total passion there, and there's curiosity, and there's pride, and there's frustration, and there's all of those things that get the negative press. But I think conversation is the beginning to all of this. Anything that gets people talking, anything that gives people a little bit of the impetus to get off their arse, I think is a great thing. And anything that can kind of demonstrate that, there's another way.